The morning I decided to remove my pool, I had no idea I was about to trigger the neighborhood war of the century. It started innocently enough, a simple conversation with my contractor about the cracked foundation beneath my 15-year-old, above-ground pool that had been the centerpiece of my backyard since I bought the house. "Mrs. Patterson," Jim the contractor had said, shaking his head as he examined the concrete pad, "this thing's gotta go. The ground's shifted so much underneath that if we don't remove it soon, you're looking at a potential sinkhole situation." I stood there in my bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, staring at the pool that had been my sanctuary for so many years. Sure, it wasn't the most beautiful thing to look at. The liner had faded from years of chlorine and sun exposure, and the deck around it had warped in several places. But it was mine. It was where I'd taught my daughter Sarah to swim before. She went off to college. It was where I'd floated on lazy Sunday afternoons, reading romance novels and forgetting about the stress of my job at the insurance company. But Jim was right. The pool had become more of a liability than an asset. The maintenance costs were astronomical, especially after the pump had broken down 3 times in the past year. The heating bills during the cooler months were enough to make me consider taking out a second mortgage, and honestly, I barely used it anymore. Sarah was grown and living across the country, and I'd found myself spending more time at the community center's pool anyway. "How long would it take?" I asked, already knowing in my heart that this was the right decision. "About a week, maybe 2, depending on how much concrete we need to break up. We'll need to drain it first, then dismantle the structure, remove the concrete pad, and fill in the area with topsoil." I nodded slowly, already envisioning the beautiful garden I could plant in its place. Maybe some roses, definitely some hydrangeas. I'd always wanted a proper English garden, but never had the space with that massive pool taking up 3/4 of my backyard. "Let's do it," I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. That was 3 weeks ago. What I didn't anticipate was that my decision would become the focal point of my neighbor Karen's entire existence. Karen Mitchell lived in the house, directly behind mine, and for the past 8 years, she'd made it her personal mission to monitor everything that happened in our cul-de-sac. She was the type of neighbor who knew exactly when everyone's garbage day was, who was having marital problems based on the frequency of raised voices, and who had called the city about Mr. Henderson's slightly overgrown lawn no fewer than 6 times, but Karen had a particular obsession with my pool. Not because she enjoyed it. God knows I'd invited her over countless times for barbecues and pool parties, only to be met with polite declinations and thinly veiled comments about property values and neighborhood aesthetics. No, Karen's obsession stemmed from something much more complex and, frankly, more disturbing. You see, Karen's house sat on a slight elevation compared to mine, which meant her bedroom window had a perfect view of my entire backyard, and for reasons I couldn't fathom, she'd positioned her home office, complete with a large picture window, to face directly toward my pool area. I'd noticed her watching from that window more times than I could count, always with the same disapproving expression, as if my very existence was a personal affront to her sensibilities. The first sign of trouble came the day the contractors arrived. I was inside making breakfast when I heard shouting from the backyard. Through my kitchen window, I could see Karen standing at our shared fence line, still in her pajamas, gesticulating wildly at Jim and his crew. "You can't just remove an established pool without proper permits," she was shouting, her voice carrying that particular pitch that meant she was working herself up into one of her famous tirades. "This is going to affect everyone's property. Values, everyone's!" Jim, bless his heart, tried to reason with her. "Ma'am, Mrs. Patterson has all the necessary permits. We wouldn't be here if she didn't." "I don't believe you," Karen shot back. "Show me the paperwork." I grabbed my coffee and headed outside, knowing I needed to intervene before this escalated further. Karen had a talent for making simple situations incredibly complicated. "Morning, Karen," I called out as pleasantly as I could manage. "Everything okay?" She whirled around to face me, her face already flushed with indignation. Karen was in her early 50s, about my age, but she carried herself with the righteous anger of someone who'd spent years feeling personally victimized by the world around her. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail, and she was wearing her usual uniform of designer athleisure wear that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. "Emma," You cannot seriously be removing your pool without consulting the neighborhood association first, she said, crossing her arms over her chest. This is a major modification that affects all of us. Karen, we don't have a neighborhood association, I replied, trying to keep my voice level. We've been over this before, and I'm removing the pool from my property, which I'm perfectly entitled to do. But the aesthetics, she protested. The continuity of the neighborhood. Do you have any idea what this is going to do to property values? This was Karen's favorite argument. Property values. She brought it up every time someone in the neighborhood wanted to paint their house a different color, plant a tree, or, God forbid, park their car in their own driveway overnight. According to Karen, everything was a threat to property values. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone to show her the real estate research I'd done, removing an aging above-ground pool typically increases property values by 3 to 5%, especially when it's replaced with landscaping. Karen's eyes narrowed as she looked at my phone, clearly not interested in facts that contradicted her narrative. That's not the point, Emma. The point is community consideration. Common courtesy. You should have discussed this with all of us before making such a drastic decision. Karen, it's my pool on my property. I don't need anyone's permission to remove it. Well, we'll see about that, she said ominously, before storming back toward her house. I should have known that wouldn't be the end of it. With Karen, it was never the end of anything. Over the next few days, as Jim and his crew worked on draining the pool and beginning the dismantling process, Karen's behavior became increasingly erratic. She started taking photos of the worksite from her bedroom window, not even trying to be subtle about it. She'd stand there with her phone pressed against the glass, documenting every step of the process like she was gathering evidence for some sort of legal case. Then came the phone calls. First, she called the city's code enforcement office to report unauthorized construction on my property. When they told her that pool removal didn't require the same permits as installation and that I was perfectly within my rights, she called the Environmental Protection Agency to report potential groundwater contamination from the pool chemicals. The EPA visit was particularly embarrassing. 2 officials showed up at my door on a Thursday morning, explaining that they'd received a complaint about improper chemical disposal. I had to walk them through my entire pool maintenance history, show them receipts for professional chemical disposal services, and provide documentation that I'd followed all proper procedures for draining the pool water. Ma'am, one of the officials said apologetically as they prepared to leave, I have to ask, is there any reason someone might want to cause trouble for you? This complaint was pretty clearly baseless, but someone went to a lot of trouble to file it. I glanced toward Karen's house where I could see her silhouette in the window, clearly watching the EPA officials leave. I'm beginning to think so, I admitted. But Karen wasn't done. Next came the homeowners insurance company. She'd somehow managed to convince them that my pool removal was creating a hazardous condition that could affect neighboring properties. I spent an entire afternoon on the phone with insurance adjusters, explaining that professional contractors were handling the removal and that there was no risk to anyone's property. The breaking point came on a Friday evening. I was sitting on my back porch enjoying a glass of wine and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. The pool was nearly gone. Just the concrete pad remained, and Jim's crew would be back on Monday to break that up and haul it away. I heard Karen's back door slam shut, followed by the sound of her footsteps on the wooden deck she'd built right up to our shared fence line. I tried to ignore her, hoping she'd just water her plants or something and go back inside. But then I heard her voice, loud and clear in the evening air. You know, Emma, some people have consideration for their neighbors. Some people understand that we're all part of a community here. I turned to look at her, and what I saw surprised me. Karen wasn't just angry, she looked genuinely distressed. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her usually perfect hair was disheveled. She was gripping the fence between our properties so tightly that her knuckles were white. Karen, are you okay? I asked, genuinely concerned despite everything she'd put me through over the past few weeks. Am I okay? She repeated, her voice rising. Am I okay? You've destroyed everything, Emma. Everything. I stood up and walked closer to the fence, trying to understand what was happening. What happened next would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. I found myself inviting Karen over for coffee the following morning, and to my surprise, she accepted. We sat at my kitchen table, two women who had been neighbors, for 8 years but strangers in every way that mattered, finally talking like human beings instead of adversaries. "I owe you an apology," Karen said, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug like it was anchoring her to reality. "The EPA, the insurance company, all those phone calls, I was out of line." "You were hurting," I replied, "and I meant it." "I get that now." We talked for 2 hours that morning. Karen told me about her marriage to Tom, how they'd grown apart over the years until they were basically roommates sharing a mortgage. She talked about her kids, Jessica and Michael, who had both moved to California after college and rarely visited. She admitted that her obsession with neighborhood standards and property values was really about control. If she couldn't control her own happiness, at least she could try to control her environment. I shared my own struggles too. The loneliness. After Richard's death 3 years ago, the way I'd thrown myself into maintaining the house and the pool as a way to avoid dealing with my grief. How I'd realized that keeping the pool was really about clinging to memories of a life that no longer existed. It was therapeutic in a way I hadn't expected. But our newfound understanding was about to be tested in ways neither of us could have imagined. The first sign that something bigger was brewing came on Tuesday morning. I was in my garden planning where to plant the hydrangeas once the concrete pad was fully removed, when my phone rang. It was Sarah, my daughter, calling from Portland. "Mom, you need to sit down," she said, her voice tight with concern. "What's wrong, honey?" "I got a call from a reporter yesterday, someone from the local news station there. They wanted to ask me about the neighborhood pool controversy and whether I thought you were being environmentally irresponsible by removing it." My blood ran cold. "What did you tell them?" "I told them it was none of their business and hung up, but Mom, how did they even know about this? How did they get my number?" I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly how, but I hoped I was wrong. "I'll figure it out, sweetheart, don't worry about it." But I was worrying, a lot. An hour later, Jim the contractor called. "Mrs. Patterson, I think you should know that someone's been calling around to other contractors in town, asking questions about our work on your property. Specifically asking if we had all the proper environmental clearances and whether we were following industry best practices for pool removal." My heart sank. What kind of questions? The kind that suggests someone's building a case against you, or against us. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've never had anyone conduct this kind of investigation into a simple pool removal. After Jim hung up, I stood in my kitchen staring out at Karen's house. Had our conversation yesterday been genuine, or had it been part of some larger manipulation? Had she been planning something even more elaborate than her previous complaints? I was about to find out. The doorbell rang at exactly 3 p.m. Through the peephole, I could see a woman in a sharp business suit holding a microphone, with a cameraman behind her. My stomach dropped. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the environmental controversy surrounding your pool removal." "There's no controversy," I said through the door. "And I have nothing to say." "Ma'am, we have documentation suggesting that proper environmental impact studies weren't conducted before you began removing what some neighbors describe as a significant water feature from your property. Would you care to comment?" I leaned against the door, my mind racing. Environmental impact studies? For removing a pool from my own backyard? This was insane, but it was also happening, which meant someone had not only contacted the media, but had provided them with what sounded like official-sounding complaints. The news crew finally left after I refused to open the door, but I knew this wasn't over. And I had a pretty good idea who was behind it. I was wrong. Dead wrong. The truth came out that evening in the most unexpected way possible. I was sitting on my front porch, trying to process everything that had happened, when Tom Mitchell, Karen's husband, came walking across the street. I'd spoken to Tom maybe 5 times in 8 years, and he'd always seemed like a decent but distant man who worked long hours and kept to himself. "Emma," he said, his face grave, "we need to talk." "If this is about the news crew..." "It's not what you think," he interrupted. "Can I sit down?" I gestured to the chair beside me, and Tom sat heavily, like a man carrying a tremendous burden. Karen didn't make those calls, he said without preamble. She didn't contact the reporter or the other contractors. That was all me. I stared at him, completely stunned. You? But why? Tom ran his hands through his graying hair. Because I'm an idiot who thought he was protecting his wife, and instead, I've made everything 1,000 times worse. The story that came out over the next hour was more twisted and heartbreaking than anything I could have imagined. Tom explained that he'd been watching Karen's obsession with my pool grow more intense over the years. He'd seen how she positioned her office to face my backyard, how she'd time her own yard work to coincide with when I was outside, how she'd make excuses to be in rooms that faced my property. At first, I thought she was just being nosy, Tom said. You know how Karen can be about neighborhood stuff, but then I realized it was something deeper. She'd spend hours at that window, and I could see how sad she looked. How hungry, I guess. Like she was starving for something she couldn't have. So you knew she was struggling, but you didn't talk to her about it? Tom's laugh was bitter. Emma, Karen, and I stopped really talking about 15 years ago. We coexist, we're polite. We handle the logistics of our life together, but we don't connect. Haven't for a long time. He explained that when he saw the contractors arrive to remove the pool, he knew Karen would be devastated. In his mind, the pool represented something important to her, though he didn't fully understand what. So he decided to try to stop the removal by creating enough bureaucratic obstacles that I'd give up. I thought if I could delay it long enough, maybe Karen would calm down and we could all move on, he said. I never intended for it to get this big. I certainly never meant for reporters to get involved. Tom, this is insane. You've caused problems for me, for my daughter, for my contractor, all because you thought your wife would be upset about me removing my own pool? I know how it sounds, he said miserably. But you have to understand, Emma. Karen hasn't been happy in years. Decades, maybe. And I felt helpless to do anything about it. When I saw that pool being removed, I saw her last bit of, I don't know what to call it, joy, hope. I couldn't just let it happen without trying to do something. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process this revelation. Tom, quiet, invisible Tom, had orchestrated an entire campaign of harassment because he thought he was protecting his wife's feelings. And the most tragic part was that he'd done it all without ever actually talking to Karen about what she was going through. Does Karen know? I asked. Not yet, but she's going to find out soon enough. The reporter called our house this morning looking for more information. Karen answered the phone. As if summoned by our conversation, Karen's front door opened and she came walking across the street toward us. But this wasn't the broken, vulnerable woman I'd talked to yesterday or the angry, controlling neighbor I'd known for years. This Karen was furious, angrier than I'd ever seen her. Thomas Michael Mitchell, she said, her voice deadly quiet. What exactly did you say to that reporter? Tom's face went pale. Karen, I can explain. Can you? Can you explain why a complete stranger just called our house asking me to confirm details about environmental concerns that you apparently shared with her? Can you explain why she knew things about Emma's pool removal that I never told anyone? I watched this unfold with a mixture of fascination and horror. Karen had figured out what Tom had done, and she was absolutely livid. I was trying to help, Tom said weakly. Help? Karen's voice rose. Help who? Help me? By making me look like a crazy person who can't handle her own problems? By making Emma think I'm some kind of stalker who would call reporters about her personal business? She turned to me and I could see tears of humiliation in her eyes. Emma, I swear to you, I had nothing to do with any of this. Yes, I was upset about the pool. Yes, I handled it badly. But I would never, ever involve the media in a private matter between neighbors. I know, I said softly. Tom just explained everything. Karen whirled back to face her husband. You what? You told her what you did? Tom, do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? Do you know how this makes me look? Karen, please, no, she shouted. You don't get to please me right now. For 23 years, I've watched you drift through our marriage like a ghost. You don't talk to me. You don't ask me how I'm feeling. You don't engage with our life together at all. But suddenly, when you think I might be upset about something, you decide to launch a one-man crusade without even asking me what I actually wanted? The pain in her voice was devastating. This wasn't just about Tom's interference with the